Hi guys, welcome and thank you for joining us for episode number 3. Whew. Seems like 3, doesn't it?
Third time's the charm.
I hear that. We're glad you're joining us today for episode number 3 of KLINGSPOR Tech Talk. Let me encourage you right off the bat, if you want to send in a question, you can go ahead and email your questions to techtalk@klingspor.com. That's TECHTALK with no spaces in between. Go ahead and email those questions in, and like I always say, if we don't get to them on today's show, because we do have a lot of things to go over today, we will most definitely get to them in a future episode. We're not going to leave you hanging.
That's right. To let you know, I am Danny Burnett.
And I am Nick DeMars. And let me encourage you too, if you want to get our newsletter and get notified whenever these events are happening, whenever one of our episodes is going to be live broadcast, just go to our website, klingspor.com, and scroll down to Tech Talk, click on Join Us Live, and then scroll down to subscribe to our newsletter. And what will happen is you will be sent a notification basically that we're having another Tech Talk coming up and some great information. And as always, the information you get here is valuable, but it's free.
Yeah.
So I encourage you to join us.
And today, we got a flood of questions in. So we've got a few questions really we're going to go over today. And so that's really pretty much our main focus today is actually answering a few questions that we got for people. Cool. So I'll start with our first one. This is from Crisscross Craft. Thank you so much, Crisscross Craft, for sending us in a question. Why does the Green 77 series use paper on the lower grits and film on the higher grits? He also says he loves this product and is just curious. Thank you so much for your question.
I can understand the love for the product because I've used it myself and it's a great product. It does exactly what it's advertised to do as far as the loading is concerned and things like that. Just to touch on it just a little bit, but let you know too, we do have a video on this subject.
Okay.
But I just want to touch on just a little bit of his question. He's talking about why does the Green Series have paper on the lower grits and film on the higher grits? Well, film is a very, very good product as far as finishing goes. It's got several really good capabilities to it, one of them being that it's a wet dry. Okay. You can use it wet or dry. But I'm going to leave the rest of that information to our video. Let's go ahead and watch that video.
All right, here's a film for the film.
GreenTec is the newest addition to our product line of abrasive discs. We offer 2 different types of disc within the 77 family, PS77 and FP77. Both of these products are made using aluminum oxide grains, but they have different types of backings and grit availability. The PS77 is a paper-backed product. Medium weight C paper makes it ideal for use with medium pressure and aggression. It is available in P60 to P220 on the grit scale. The FP77 has a 3 mil film backing. This allows it to be tear resistant and waterproof. It is available in grits P320 to P2000. The key aspect of GreenTec products that make them unique is the fact that they are anti-loading. Loading occurs when you sand soft or gummy materials such as gel coats, soft metals, and woods. The soft materials stay on the abrasives and seem to clog the surface. GreenTec has a T-Act top coat. T-Act is a specialized proprietary resin top coat that goes on top of the grains and forms a stronger bond while exposing more of the grains, making GreenTec ideal when aggression and longer disc life are important. The other features of this technology includes reduced heat buildup, and most importantly, less loading than virtually any other disc. Here we see the PS77 after a while of use. GreenTec is a material that can often be cleaned with an air hose and or run on a cloth to reveal all the grains again. As I mentioned before, the FP77 is waterproof. Here we took a water bottle and sprayed the surface before sanding. The disc still works great with no chance of ripping or tearing, and often the performance is greatly enhanced. When the FP77 gets loaded, you can simply take a wet cloth and wipe it clean. Call KLINGSPOR today to get those abrasives in your hands.
So as you can see, those anti-loading capabilities are just completely amazing.
Oh man,
I mean, I never thought I would ever see an abrasive like that, that you could completely wipe every bit of that loading right off that
Oh,
disc.
yes.
It's really, really cool. And you know, when you talk about these things, he's asking about the difference between the paper and the film. If you stop and think about any of the abrasive backings, of course, we've got cloth, we've got paper, and we've got film. The cloth, now when you apply abrasive grains to any particular material, it's going to take on basically the contour, or the however that backing material is shaped. With cloth, it's a bunch of threads woven together. So that's not really a super flat surface. That cloth is going to be mainly, you know, for strength, for durability, for some of the lower grits. Then we move up to paper, where paper is a much flatter media.
Oh yeah.
So when we apply abrasive grains to that paper, what's going to happen is it's going to take on the characteristic of that paper, which is fairly flat. But then we move on to film, and film is by far the flattest of them all. Okay. So when we apply those abrasive grains, we've got a completely even surface, which is going to leave a great scratch pattern on whatever you're working on.
Oh yeah.
Okay. And then when you consider also that this is a wet-dry product in the film, it's going to be great for those wet-dry applications.
Oh yeah.
Automotive, or whatever the case may be, some epoxies, boat hulls, whatever you're working on.
Oh yeah. And so it's pretty much what you're saying is like, so the reason why paper is in those lower grits because it cannot give as good a finish as that film can with all the other properties, of course, of that 77 material.
That's exactly right.
That's crazy. All right, so we got another question for you. When it comes to using sandpaper, what is the difference between sanding hardwood and softwood?
Great question. So we could get pretty deep into this and talk about the different types of wood and how they're made, how they're formed, because see, some woods have pores. Most woods have pores. There are some woods that are all fibers, okay? And they will soak in a lot of stain, stuff like that. But the thing you want to consider when difference between hardwoods and softwoods is that softwoods are very resinous and very oily. Okay. And what happens is these resins and oils heat up during the sanding process, and they begin to load up the abrasive, just like we saw with the 77 series. That abrasive is begin to load. Now, of course, with the 77 series, that loading will all come right off.
Yeah, you can wipe it off.
With a lot of other abrasives, you might run into a problem there. And I want to mention too, you know, when we're talking about hardwoods and softwoods, a lot of people don't know, but how to tell whether one is considered a hardwood or considered a softwood is by considering the leaves of the tree. If it's a broad, flat leaf, then it's a hardwood. If it's a needle-like leaf or a flat-looking needle-like leaf, kind of like the cedar, for instance, then it's a softwood. And the ironic thing about that is some softwoods are very hard and some hardwoods are very soft. If you consider yellow pine is a softwood. But if you've ever tried to put a 16-penny nail in a piece of yellow pine, you know it just doesn't work all that well.
I'll remember that next time I'm walking through the woods, I can just look up and say, all right,
softwood,
go.
hardwood. Yep. Take a little tag with you. You could tag every tree on the way by.
So we do have another question from Ted. Ted asked, what do you recommend for a drum sander? I feel like this is a crazy question.
Okay, so it really is going to depend a lot upon your particular application. Now see, in my mind, and the way I came up in the woodworking industry, when you use a drum sander, you're doing one of two things. You're removing material. Let's say, for instance, you're taking a 13/16 board and you want to remove a 1/16 of an inch of material, get it down to 3/4 so it'll match up with the plywood you're using. Okay. That's what we call material removal, or planing, dimensioning, several terms for it. And then we've got intermediate sanding. Now, the planing and dimensioning I was talking about begins at about 24 grit, and you can go all the way up to 60 grit. Then you go to intermediate sanding, which is 120, or 80 to 120. Okay. And then from there on, 150 on up, we go to finishing. So in my mind, when we're using a drum sander, we're doing one of the first two steps. We're doing some material removal or some intermediate sanding. So when I recommend abrasives for a drum sander, I like to go with our staple CS311Y.
Okay.
That CS311 is a good open coated material, which is to say that it's not 100% grain coverage on the backing. So that's going to leave room for loading. Okay, to take place. And a lot of times when that loading takes place, it'll get heavy and it'll flake off in the process, or there's a lot of space in between those grains for that loading to take place. But that 311Y is a good material for a drum sander.
Okay, so let's stick with that. So going with the open and closed coat. With that right there. So I get what you were saying with the open coat. It pretty much it's spaced out the grains so that way it has time to flake out and everything like that. So what about for a closed coat? What does that really mean for us?
Okay, so we've got 3 designations here. We've got an open coat, a closed coat, and a semi-open coat. Okay, so we talked about the open coat already. A closed coat, you've got 100% grain coverage on that backing. Okay, so what that's going to do, and if at all possible, if you have a material that doesn't load, we encourage you to use the closed coat.
So like a hardwood.
Like a hardwood, because you're going to have a good even scratch pattern all the way through using that thing.
Okay.
And then we have our semi-open coat, which is about 70% grain coverage, give or take a little bit.
Okay.
And that's kind of the best of both worlds. It's a real universal material. In fact, our PS33 is our best-selling material. And that is a semi-open coat. Like I say, it's a really universal material. You can finish with it. You can do material removal with it. It's a really, really good setup.
Okay, so pretty much on a true general scale, if it's an open coat, you want to go with the softwoods. If it's a closed coat, you want to go with the hardwoods.
Exactly.
And then if you're using the semi-open coat, you can do hardwood and softwood, correct?
You got it.
Man, okay. That's a lot right there. Great, well, so we have another question. How can I know the correct angle to cut on sandpaper to correctly wrap my drum sander?
Okay, this is a cool one. I like the way this works. So if you look at your drum sander, you take either a flexible tape measure, like a cloth tape measure of some sort, or maybe even a piece of string, and you wrap that, hold it on one spot on the drum, and wrap that around and get a measurement. That circumference of that drum is exactly equal to the length of the angle that you need to cut. So what I'm saying is the length of the angle from here to here, that length is exactly equal to the circumference of that drum.
Wow, that's cool.
So if you get that measurement on that drum, and then you take your tape measure and you hold from one side to the other and slide it back and forth until it matches that measurement, you'll have that correct angle for your drum sander.
Yeah, for us, being in tech school, I feel like that's a question we do get a lot, and so that's definitely something to take note for, not just for y'all, but also any of your cohorts out there. That's just such an easy kind of thing, because I went to a lot of shops and they actually have a pre-cut piece that they'll put in there and do it. Whereas if they have this knowledge, if they ever lose that pre-cut piece, like I'm sure everybody has at least once.
And that's exactly what I like to recommend to people when they call in and ask that question, is to go ahead and cut yourself a pattern. Then you don't have to go worry with all that every time.
That's
then
right.
You just lay that pattern on your abrasive, take a knife, score down that thing, you've got your angle.
Oh, okay. All right, so I've got a question for you coming from Coleman. Coleman, thank you for your question. Which is better, zirconia or aluminum oxide? And I'm guessing in the wood market.
And the answer to that question is yes. The reason I say that is because it's going to depend again upon which application you're doing.
Okay.
All right. The Alumina Zirconia is a very, very hard abrasive grain. Okay. And it's really good at material removal.
Okay.
Now, the aluminum oxide will do the same thing. The thing you have to be aware of is the Alumina Zirconia is going to last a little longer, especially in wood. And the second thing being is that the aluminum oxide, price-wise, you're going to find is a little less expensive than the Alumina Zirconia.
Okay.
So you just have to balance out in your mind whether you want that longevity and pay a little bit of extra money, or you want to go with a less expensive product than the aluminum oxide. They're both good, viable options. It's just a couple of different characteristics.
I'm with you. I will tell you for me personally, so for the zirconia, I like to use that in your lower grit. So, your 24, your 36 grit, when you're doing that really hardcore removal. And then from that point right there, I'll move up into that aluminum oxide, and that's just me. But doing your lower grits, 24, 36, 40, in that range right through there, even maybe a little bit in 60, not as much, I'll hit the zirconia, and then I'll move up to that aluminum oxide because it works through it. Also, when dealing with wood, we do have a aluminum zirconia that is a semi-open coat. So that way right there, you don't have to worry as much about that loading feature because it is that semi, so it can do its removal and you won't have to worry about it loading up as bad. So it does help out on those. So for me, I do know it's a 416. That's the one I would go with, feels me.
And what is the backing on that?
That is a Y, so it's a polyester backing.
Polyester backing. Good, tough stuff right there.
Oh, yes, it is.
So I want to encourage you again, if you're viewing right now and if you've come up with some kind of question, maybe something you've been facing recently in your own shop, and you want to send in a question, and you're welcome to go ahead and email us at TechTalk@KLINGSPOR.com. Spell it again, that's TechTalk, no spaces, at KLINGSPOR.com. And we'll be glad to get to your questions. If we don't get to them right now during this episode, we will definitely address those questions later on down the line.
Oh, yeah. All right. So got another question for you since we're doing pretty much questions on this one. Which grit should I stop sanding at before applying a finish?
Another good question. And it's interesting to see how many different variations we have as far as what people's process is when it comes to finishing. I was once at a cabinet shop where they finished at 120 grit.
Okay.
Which is a little bit lower than most people. We usually recommend the finishing process to begin at 150 grit. And as far as working on bare wood, take it up to 220 grit if you think you want to go that high. To me, the sweet spot is 150, 180, just depending on the type of wood you're using.
Okay.
But what happens is if you go up with bare wood, if you go up past that 220 grit, you remember I mentioned earlier that wood has pores.
Yep.
If you would imagine you've got a handful of straws, you're looking at the ends of those straws, you see all those little holes.
Okay.
That's kind of a decent representation of what the pores in the wood look like. And those are the areas that are going to grab the stain and hold it.
Okay.
Okay. So if you go up past 220 grit, what begins to happen is you begin to either polish or burnish the wood, just depends on which term you're used to using. And what you're doing is you're starting to close off the pores of the wood. So it's going to take less and less and less stain. And as you're doing that, it's really hard to do it really even. So you end up with a dark spot over here and a light spot over there, whatever the case may be.
Okay.
So no higher than 220 is my general rule.
Okay. I'm with you. So got a question here from Adam. Thank you, Adam. I just bought my first wide belt sander. Should I use a paper belt or a cloth belt?
Okay, so we just talked about some of the processes, material removal, intermediate sanding, finish sanding, and we stated that finish sanding should begin at 150 grit, okay? So you have to consider this when you're deciding whether to use paper or cloth. Cloth is going to be better for the material removal. It's going to be better for the intermediate sanding. But because of the fact of the F-weight paper being much a flatter surface for those abrasive grains to be stuck to, we encourage you to go to an F-weight paper belt for a wide belt sander in the finishing process.
Okay. Adam, man, good luck with your wide belt machine. Another question. I keep finding pigtail marks when I wipe on the stain. So, excuse me. I keep finding the pigtail marks when I wipe on the stain. What is the cause of this, and how can I avoid this?
I like to call those loop-de-loops.
Loop-de-loops.
Loop-de-loops, yeah. I know it's kind of corny, but that's just the way it works. So we have actually got a very in-depth video about swirl marks and how to avoid them and what kind of things go into making the swirl marks and what kind of swirl marks you see might indicate what your issue is. We put together a video in conjunction with KLINGSPOR's Woodworking Shop, our sister company.
Oh, yeah.
And they did a very good job helping us with this thing. And let's go ahead and take a look at this video about swirl marks.
Hey, I'm Mike Z with KLINGSPOR's Woodworking Shop, and in today's video we're going to be discussing swirl marks. You know, that pigtails and zigzags you commonly get with power sanding. What we're going to be discussing is the proper grit sequence you can look for in your finishing schedule, tips and tricks to help prevent creating them in the first place, and getting the most sanding power for your money. Let's jump in. These are swirl marks. They're typically going to be unsightly marks that don't match up with the grain of the wood. Sometimes they can be half moons strung together. Sometimes they can just be a bunch of smaller marks all put together. But either way, they're unsightly on your bare wood piece. Swirl marks will eventually happen in the coarser grits, and what this video is going to show you is how you can get rid of them easily and effectively every time. Let's start with the basics. Here's a piece of wood we sanded with 80 grit. You'll notice the depth of that 80 grit original scratch. If we sand with 120 on top of that, what we're doing is actually lowering the peaks of the original 80 grit scratch. And then if we follow it up with 180, we're lowering down the peaks of the 120 to meet the original scratch left by the 80 grit. This is called the leveling principle in abrasives. So on our subject piece, we have bare wood cherry, stained, clear coated, gray paint, white paint, and this will show you the depth of scratch down that sandpaper can cause. So let's go ahead and start out with 80 grit on this workpiece. You'll notice that it removes the stock extremely quickly, removes the paint quickly, and it makes very fast work of this job. What you want to look for is uniform scratches, half circles, half moons if you will. They kind of look like this. What that tells you is that you're getting an even amount of pressure on the workpiece, leveling everything down nice and even. So if 80 grit does all these wonderful things, fast stock removal, lasts a long time, why wouldn't you use it? Well, sometimes on certain applications like cherry and maple, it actually leaves too deep of a scratch and causes pigtail swirls. This is something that naturally happens with this grit, but in order to avoid it, maybe you need to start at 120. Let's take a look. Sometimes to save yourself a step in the process, it's a lot better to actually start with a grit or two finer than what you suspect you need for your project. In this case here, we're using 120. You'll notice that the 120 doesn't remove the paint as fast, but it's a lot more even and level. So with that said, you're still going to get pigtails and swirl marks, but they're not going to be as deep as the 80 grit scratch. As a matter of fact, 80 grit is 60% larger of a grain than 120. So if you don't need to start out that aggressive, save yourself the time and the money and start out with 120 instead. So starting out with a finer grit will save you more time and money, which is what KLINGSPOR does when it brings you the most sanding power for your money. So let's talk improper sanding techniques. In this part here, you notice that I'm going to make this mark on the sanding pad so you can see how it rotates. First thing you don't want to do is start the sander above the workpiece and then place it down on the workpiece at full speed. Even with a pneumatic sander, whenever you do this, what you're doing is causing dishing and swirl marks, very deep gouges that are going to be harder to sand out later. The best fundamental practice whenever using a random orbit sander, whether it's electric or pneumatic, is to start the sander on the workpiece. When you're done with the sanding process for that grit, is to take the sander off and turn it off. So remember, on, off, off. Another improper sanding technique is to stop the sander while on the workpiece. This also causes swirl marks with the previous grit that you used. A random orbit sander should always be sanded the full width of the disc, never put on an angle because it's not an angle grinder. While it does look like it's removing material quicker, it's actually building up heat, causing gumming to happen. So if you happen to have discs that are loading on the outside edges, typically this is caused by an improper sanding angle. You should always be parallel to the work surface in order to ensure proper leveling. Now let's take a look at another improper sanding technique. This is the workpiece vibrating on a flat surface. These vibrations then cause the workpiece itself to vibrate because of the random orbit action. This causes swirl marks as well. These scratches typically look like cat scratches where they're just real short against the grain off at an angle. And these can be eliminated by using an isolating sanding pad, a rubber block, or even a moving blanket, something that'll isolate the actual workpiece from the work table, not causing the workpiece to vibrate. If you notice there's this low spot on your workpiece, we typically want to angle the sander to get just that spot, but that's not the way to do it. Instead, keep the sander flat, moving it across the entire area, leveling everything around it to the lower spot. It doesn't take as long, and you'll have a beautiful finish when you're done. So hopefully today's video explained a little bit more about why you might be experiencing swirl marks in your workpiece. I'm Mike Z with KLINGSPOR's Woodworking Shop. Please check out KLINGSPOR Abrasives USA on YouTube for more technical videos and product videos. And on behalf of everyone at KLINGSPOR Abrasives, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.
Such a great video.
It is.
You know, a big thank you to the KLINGSPOR's Woodworking Shop for helping us out with that. And you know, I feel like that's a lot of information on loop-de-loops, as you say, on those. Yeah, such a great video for that, because it goes into really good detail about how to prevent those. Because you know, everybody's going to get them, but how can we prevent them? So that's so awesome.
Absolutely.
So I do have another question for you. All right. So, can you talk a little bit about the different grains on sandpaper? What differences does it make? What differences does it make which one you use for any of the material?
Okay, and you know, it's like you said, they'll all sand, every one of them. But I'm sure you've been there at some point in your life, and I've been there myself. You run down to the local hardware store and you grab what they have on the shelf.
Oh yeah, well,
just completely oblivious to whether it's the best product for the thing you're doing or not.
Oh yeah.
So this is why people ask these questions about the different abrasive grains. I think people are starting to get a little more aware of some of the differences in sandpaper. So we have 4 different basic abrasive grains. Now there are more than this, but the 4 main ones that you see out in the market today are aluminum oxide, silicon carbide, alumina zirconia, and ceramic aluminum oxide.
Okay.
To start at the top, we have aluminum oxide. We've talked about it a lot. It's a good universal abrasive grain. But the way aluminum oxide acts as you're using it is it starts to wear, to round off, kind of like a pencil. You know, if you're using like a number 2 pencil with lead, or I say lead, these days it's graphite in there. But that thing will slowly start to round off. Well, that's the way aluminum oxide is. Don't let that alarm you. It's not going to happen right away. That's a good, long-lasting abrasive grain. But that's just when it does start to wear. That's how it does it. Next, we move to silicon carbide. Silicon carbide is considered second in hardness only to diamond.
Wow.
Okay? That's why it's so popular in the glass industry, because you know as well as I do, diamonds cut glass really well, or scratch glass, or whatever the case may be. So silicon carbide, since it's very hard like that, it's also brittle. It's got little, I read about it, it's got little fracture lines in there. And as you're using the silicon carbide, as it starts to catch and starts to, I guess you could say, wear or chip out, it actually fractures. And when it does, it resharpens itself.
Okay.
So the cool thing about silicon carbide is it's continually resharpening itself and sanding the same all the way through the work.
Okay, so like if you got a 120 grit, you're pretty much going to finish with a 120 grit.
Absolutely.
That's cool.
So next we have alumina zirconia, and the analogy I like to use here is if aluminum oxide and silicon carbide went out on a date, 9 months later we have alumina zirconia. The reason I say that is because alumina zirconia is also friable. It'll fracture. It'll do it one time, and then it starts to round off like the aluminum oxide is.
Okay.
So it has kind of both the capabilities of the first 2 grains. And then finally we move to ceramic aluminum oxide, and ceramic aluminum oxide is a very, very hard abrasive grain. Probably the hardest of the or more durable of the 4. And it's also friable, but as far as wood is concerned, we try to discourage people from using ceramic on wood because it's friable, yeah, but under very high pressure.
Okay, so wood doesn't really have the abilities to bring it back.
Withstand, that's right.
Correct.
So if you're scratching with ceramic aluminum oxide, you're probably digging very deep.
Okay.
And good possibility that you could have to go backwards in the process to clean up the scratches that was left behind by the ceramic.
Okay.
Some people do use it. You know, if you're that way and you use it, fine, good for you. You've got you a process that works, but generally we try to steer away from that as far as wood is concerned.
Good deal. Well, and that's actually all the questions we've got time for. Thank you all for viewing with us today. I want to let you know our next Tech Talk is September 15th. be at the same time, so 3 o'clock. This episode's actually going to go over flat discs, so it's really going to be more on the metal side of things. So we're gonna have some fun with the metal. If you have any questions for us, either for this episode or if you kind of already have questions in your mind for the flat disc, feel free to email us at techtalks@klingspor.com. So that's TECHTALK @klingspor.com. Thank you all for viewing with us today.
Good day.